So who the fuck is Freud? Well, I actually kind of can't believe that I haven't spoke about our dear old pal Sigmund Freud really yet at all on this show. But there's a first time for everything, kids, so buckle up. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist who was active in the late 19th and early 20th century. So he's officially considered the father of modern psychoanalysis, which is that, lie back on the couch and tell your therapist about your dreams kind of therapy. And unofficially, by me, considered to be the grandfather of the daddy-dom little girl and mummy kinks. For example, there was the case of Bertha Pappenheim, known famously under the pseudonym Anna O, in Freud's writing. Anna O was the patient of Freud's teacher, Dr. Joseph Breuer, and a lot of Freud's early thinking about, the utility of talking therapies was based on their course of treatment. So Anna O was a young woman of high intelligence who began experiencing visual disturbances, hallucinations, partial paralysis, and speech problems shortly after the death of her father. Dr. Breuer diagnosed Anna with hysteria, a fan favorite of clinicians treating women in the late 19th century, more on that later, and succeeded in treating her illness exclusively through talking therapy and hypnosis. So this consisted of first putting Anna into a hypnotized state and letting her detail extensively the various daydreams that she suffered from when she was in her frequent states of what Freud would call absence, or what we might today call something more like disassociation. And once she had exhausted these details, asking her more explicitly about the first time she had experienced the various symptoms that she suffered from. And it was in these discussions on the origins of her afflictions, in the uncovering of what we might call the original traumas, that Breuer was ultimately able to cure Anna. Now, a philosopher that we've spoken about quite a lot on this show, particularly in the episode on community, is Michel Foucault, and he has written extensively about the power dynamics that surround medical language. So in the 1960s, Foucault coined the term the medical gaze to describe the power dynamic that's occurring when we're using diagnostic language. And in both books, he does this very typically Foucault-type argument, where he takes the general assumption that society has gradually gotten better, more humane, and more progressive over the course of history, that's inherent to a lot of Western thought, and he picks it apart, essentially arguing, well, look, we might think that X thing here being modern psychiatry, is better than what came before, just letting mad people roam around free and largely untreated. But actually, here's why X thing is in fact much more repressive and inhumane. And this is essentially the same basic structure of argument that he makes in all his books, or at least the ones that I've read. So he does this with like the modern prison system and Discipline and Punish, arguing that it actually created a carceral state that was far more repressive because it's based on near total surveillance than the old regimes of just like chopping people's hands off in the village square for crime. He's also done it with sexual norms and history of sexuality, where he argued that modern sexual politics may appear more liberated than historical ones, but they actually aren't because of XYZ. Basically, Foucault's take is always to disrupt the notion of linear progress through historical time and argue that everything that seems less like a prison nowadays is actually much more like a prison than historical prisons. And I think that the history of psychiatry's treatment of women, particularly poor women, is an instructive example of this. Predictably then, by the mid-19th century, the majority of not only asylum patients, but all psychiatric patients in England were women. And the reason for this is a kind of patriarchal pathologization of female distress. So what do I mean by that? Well, the term pathologization just means to interpret something as a disease or disorder. So you could say to me, like, I feel sad, and I could hear that as your current state of mind. Or if I were in a pathologizing mood, I could hear that as the symptom of some kind of wider mental disorder. What about patriarchal? Well, the term patriarchy gets thrown around a lot, and it's not like often explained, so I'm going to give it a shot here. So the word itself comes from the Greek word patriarchos, meaning ruling father, and is often used to refer to a system of governance that follows this kind of daddy knows best approach. So there is supposed to be this superficially benevolent but ultimately quite tyrannical male authority figure in whose gaze women are largely infantilized, if not directly excluded. It's a kind of patronizing but brutal authority. And if we take the two terms together, a patriarchal pathologization of female distress refers then to this tyrannical father figure who's looking at women's distress and making it out to be some kind of illness or disease. Now, historian Elaine Showalter has described how in the 19th century, almost all behavior in women, both in and outside of the asylum, that was seen as disruptive to the traditional sex-based roles of Victorian society, was pathologized in some way. And importantly, that this pathologization was expressed in biological and not really in environmental terms. So what I mean by that is, if something is expressed in environmental terms or given environmental causes, you could say X thing is happening because of these circumstances. If something is expressed in biological terms or given biological causes, you would say X is happening because of the biological factors that this person has. So it's the contrast between a nature and a nurture framing. Why is that important? Well, the majority of asylum patients in the mid-19th century were not just any women, but they were poor women. And in part, this was because certain supposed mental diseases were linked specifically to poor women, such as lactational insanity, which was thought to be a kind of anemia-induced madness brought on by prolonged periods of breastfeeding in malnourished poor mothers who could not otherwise afford to feed their children. But as Showalter highlights, even when physicians were discussing lactational insanity, they were, for the most part, not really engaging with the obvious underlying environmental cause, which was that many poor mothers couldn't afford to feed their families. Instead, they were focusing on how this was just one of the many examples of the ways in which the female reproductive cycle was littered with risk points for madness. In fact, new mothers were thought to be particularly at risk of insanity with so-called puerperal mania, not sure if that's the right pronunciation, but there we go, being such a widespread theory that it was commonly accepted as a criminal defense in cases of infanticide. So Showalter writes, such social causes of the disorder as poverty, inadequate obstetrical care, and the stigma of bearing illegitimate children were sometimes cited as contributing factors. So Brown was a British gynecologist and obstetrical surgeon who was struck off the register of the Obstetrical Society of London in 1867 and was known for championing clitoridectomies, which is the surgical removal of the clitoris and sometimes parts of the labia, as the cure for all madness in women. Now, it's important to note that Brown was not struck off the register for his belief in the utility of clitoridectomies, which were still accepted as valid treatment for female insanity by many in the medical profession, but rather because Brown was accused of tricking and otherwise not fully informing his patients of what the procedure entailed, potentially ruining their marriage prospects because these women were seen as mutilated. So the concern for Brown's female patients comes again from this very patriarchal place. It's not about, the woman's own personal well-being or bodily integrity. It is about how the procedure may affect her attractiveness to men. In sum, far from questioning the position of women as primarily objects of male desire or recognizing their autonomy as full human beings, the logic behind striking Brown from the register was firmly rooted in the logic of patriarchy. After the final decision to expel Brown was made, the Secretary of the Royal Obstetrical Society had this to say: "We have constituted ourselves, as it were, the guardians of their women's interests, and in many cases the custodians of their honor. We are in fact the stronger and they the weaker. They are obliged to believe all that we tell them. They are not in a position to dispute anything we say to them. We therefore may be said to have them at our mercy. Under these circumstances, if we should depart from the strictest principles of honor, or if we should cheat or victimize them in any shape or way, we would be unworthy of the profession of which we are members." This speech was met with loud cheers from the gallery.